But there's always folks who are new to the church. So to give a little background, Jean-Francois is a political scientist who taught for over 35 years at Columbia University, Georgetown University, and Johns Hopkins University. He has 25 plus years experience in international banking and finance, of which 10 years he spent in the Middle East. He has written extensively and lectured about the industrialization and politics of the Arab-Persian Gulf. And now he is raising, over 100 sheep on his and Thackeray's farm. So that sounds like a lecture in and of itself, but for another day. So we are thrilled to have you again. He will lecture first, and then we'll have time for question and answer. And please be aware, if your car is in the garage, it is free until 2 o'clock. So we will be ending by 1:30, so you'll have more than enough time to get out of the garage. So thank you. Welcome back, and we're glad you're here. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
We should put this up here, John?
Well, I think it's working on the microphone.
Is it?
Is it? Okay. So we'll leave it like this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, it's truly a pleasure to be back. It's also pretty scary because I've not given a lecture in 2.5 years. And I feel very, very, very rusty, I must say. And I'm no longer teaching, so I'm retired from teaching in that sense. And so also that makes it much more difficult because it doesn't come naturally anymore, which it used to quite well for me in the old days. I enjoyed it very much. But now I'm taking care of the sheep, and I can tell you the sheep are a lot more interesting than a lot of the people. And so that would say that's the thing about sheep, because I have great trust into it's not working. Okay, very good. At both or just one?
Just the one.
Okay, so I don't need that. All right.
Sorry.
No problem. Okay, so talking about the Middle East is a endless topic. It keeps coming back every year, all the time, and there's something new all the time, and the same old things for the last few thousand years. But and especially today, when we have the problems we're having in the war in Europe, some of the problems are very, very different. Although I'll be very happy to try to relate them to the Middle East, because some of it will have an impact, and feel free to interrupt and ask questions at any time, actually. I love questions because this way I don't have to think quite as much to say something smart, which is getting harder and harder with things to come. But I thought since I didn't really trust the electronics working very well, I actually copied some maps for you, and I thought we could actually work from the map to give you a little catch up on the few issues that come up in the Middle East. We tend to think of the Middle East as just Iran these days, and I certainly do, because it's all these troubles between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Iraq and all that. But there are many other places where they also have problems, believe it or not. And perhaps I'd like to start from the West and just remind us what these issues are. You have a country called Morocco, which we all know, of course, and Algeria, and there are tremendous problems between Morocco and Algeria. Now, this is very interesting because they're basically the same people, and they're Bedouins, and they speak the same type of language. They speak Arabic, of course, but they speak they speak the Kabyle language from the mountains as well. A lot of the people do anyway. Most of the populations are Muslims and Sunni Muslims, and they're very, very similar. But there are no diplomatic relationship between Algeria and Morocco. They've actually closed the border. And not only that, but Algeria used to send natural gas, and that has some importance for Ukraine, by the way, but one of the largest producers of gas in the world is Algeria. And they used to send natural gas by pipeline through Morocco to Spain. And they just shut that down last November. So there's no more gas going to Spain, and therefore no more natural gas going to Morocco. Morocco, of course, wealth is in phosphates, But to really run phosphates, you need as much sulfur as you need phosphate, and the sulfur comes usually with the gas. You also need a lot of natural gas for energy. And because of this, the problems between Algeria and Morocco are huge. The problem is based on something which the Moroccans called South Morocco, which the Algerians called Western Sahara, and which is basically has been annexed by Morocco. So they have never worked together, and Algeria would love to have a good relationship with the Polisario Front, which is sort of the people of the Western Sahara, because that would give them a window to the Atlantic, of course. And they cannot have that, and the Moroccans have taken it, literally, they've annexed it. So no decision here, it's been going on for years and years and years and years, and it will not change for the near future. So that's a problem. Then you have Tunisia is also a problem today. We had a revolution in Tunisia which kicked out Ben Ali, the dictator, a few years back. And they had actually a democracy started, but that's ended. The president has taken over, the elected president of Tunisia has taken over, and he's now leading Tunisia as if it were just he feels that the stability of Tunisia is absolutely necessary and will only exist if he has all the power. And it seems to be a point for many people, but he's doing it that way. Then we have Libya. And Libya, I'm sorry, but I can't spend much time on Libya because it is so complicated that if we put a finger in the vice, we'll never get out. It's basically you have two parts in Libya nowadays. You have the western part, which has a government, and the eastern part, which used to have a government, they're now united, then now they're breaking up again. And they're all deciding whether or not there should be an election or not an election to decide whether Libya should be united again. Now, Libya is a very small country. It's only, 3 or 4 million people, 3 million people at most, but it's a rich country. It used to produce 2 million barrels a day of oil, and now it's producing a lot less. Although it's been coming back up again, which of course finances the various factions and sub-factions and so on. Very, very difficult situation. While I'm talking about North Africa, let me just say that on the map you will have here, you will see that you won't see it, but there are some sources of natural gas which go directly from North Africa to Europe. And that's of some importance in the present situation we have today in Ukraine, because Algeria sends gas to Spain. It has now, the pipeline I mentioned, which went through Morocco, is now shut down, but they have another pipeline which goes straight from Algeria directly into Spain, under the sea. And Algeria also has a pipeline that goes from Tunisia, through Tunisia, into Italy, through the Straits of Messina into Italy. Libya has a pipeline going to Italy as well. And that pipeline, in spite of the civil war in Libya and so on, has never stopped working. So the Italians played a very, very intelligent game here, and it's still working. Then you have Egypt. Now, Egypt, of course, as we know, is under the control of President Sisi, who is an absolute dictator today. And he has become a dictator because the Muslim Brothers had taken over the power after Mubarak, and that created a lot of problems for a lot of people, and it was a bit unstable, so the military basically took over, and Sisi again, and Sisi controls the place with an iron fist. Now, from a gas standpoint, since we have to talk about gas these days, Egypt is very important because Egypt has a lot of natural gas, in fact, and they have a lot of natural gas in the north, in the sea, in the Mediterranean Sea, offshore from the Nile Delta, and that gas is being sent back into Egypt, and it can be made into liquid natural gas, which they're doing, which then can be shipped. And there's a lot of efforts to try to see if we can ship more of that liquid natural gas to Europe to make up for some of the Russian gas. Will never make up for all the Russian gas, but that's a little effort. There is also natural gas in Israel, and there are 2 fields in Israel which are not producing. And that gas is used by Israel as gas, and it's not made into liquid natural gas, even though there are talks of Israel sending its own gas to Egypt to use their liquid natural gas plants to make liquid natural gas plants that then could be sold worldwide. They also have some plans to do it in Turkey and in Cyprus, but that's not happening yet. Lebanon has gas as well, but they cannot use it because there's a border dispute between Lebanon and Israel. So they cannot, the gas companies cannot drill. It's too dangerous. So that's a big problem for Lebanon, because Lebanon could make some money, perhaps bring some stability. We'll talk about that some more. So, but Egypt at this point is very stable and is growing pretty well, but not exactly shining democracy, with a city on the hill and all that. Forget that. It's very, very tough, very tight. Of course, Egypt has a lot of problems with a lot of countries around. One of the main countries they have problem with is Ethiopia, by the way. And Ethiopia, which doesn't touch Egypt, but Ethiopia has made this huge dam in the mountains, which dams the White Nile, and basically is trying to develop Ethiopia, because if they are able to finish the dam, there will be enough electricity for the entire country of Ethiopia, and also provide water for the agriculture. That annoys Sudan in particular, and Egypt especially, because that water goes into Egypt. And they need the water very badly, so they are afraid that Ethiopia would have a lot of strength to block the water to Egypt. So Egypt has actually threatened to militarily attack the dam by airplanes. And the only reason it has not done that is because the US has put a lot of pressure on them not to do this. And it's not that obvious either, frankly. I mean, to send airplanes like this down to Ethiopia. But Ethiopia is no part of the Middle East, so we'll skip on that today. Let me move on to Saudi Arabia and Iraq and the Gulf in general, and of course Syria. If you remember, 4 years ago I gave a lecture here on Syria, and I think the conclusion of that lecture is that we don't understand anything about what's happening in Syria because it's just too complicated. And you know what? It really has not changed. It's really the difficult part in Syria is that President Assad has managed to basically kill all his enemies that he could find, but Syria is still very much divided, even though it's slightly more peaceful right now, but the north of Syria is still under the control of Al-Qaeda, basically, and ISIS and all the extremist group. The eastern part, and that's probably 20% of the country, is under the control of the Kurds, and the rest is under the control of President Assad, who has support from the Russian. And so it becomes a little bit complicated. Now, the President Assad is still in power. Okay, he has military support from the Russians, but his main support is actually from Iran. And Iran plays an enormous role in Syria because Iran controls Hezbollah. Now, if you remember, Hezbollah means the party of God, and Hezbollah is a Shia group which is really very much financed by Iran. And Iran has used Hezbollah to basically take over Lebanon. Today, Lebanon is controlled by the Iranians. We can say it any way we want, but Lebanon is really controlled by the Iranians through Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is a military power which became a strong military power because it was attacked very extensively by Israel, and they managed to actually survive those attacks and have become stronger than ever before. So now Hezbollah is present and has always been, is a majority, well, we don't really know, but probably at least 30% to 50% of the population of Lebanon is Shia, we think. We don't really know. But they control basically the government today, even though officially the government is Christian, Sunni, and Shia, all working together happily. The fact is it's controlled by Iran through Hezbollah. The Hezbollah controls, militarily helps Assad, the president Assad, in Syria. So through Hezbollah, Syria is really controlled by Iran. But Hezbollah also controls Yemen. And that's very important. And I don't know if you've read that, but there has, almost every day, there are drones being sent by the Houthis, which is the sort of the main leaders of Yemen today, who are in the capital, although they're not the official government, but they control Yemen in great part, not entirely. But they send missiles and they send drones to the Gulf to attack Saudi Arabia in particular, and now they started attacking the UAE. And that's very important because the UAE is the big business center, especially for the foreigners in the region. And they have actually sent some drones, and those drones are built by Hezbollah, with, of course, Iranian designs and Iranian money. So that is really where we are on the Yemen issue. The civil war in Yemen, where you have the official government, which is supported by Saudi Arabia, which is basically Sunni, and is fighting the Houthis, which is basically, and this is, you know, one can argue it in many ways, since it's about religion, anything you can make it say whatever you want, and anyway, the Houthis are more or less Shia, and in this case they are true Shia because they are helped by the Iranians, right? So that is, Iran has its arm all the way around Saudi Arabia. Iraq is the other sort of piece of that puzzle of surrounding the Gulf by Iran. And Iraq today is actually technically a democracy in the sense that they have elections, they have parties, and so on, but de facto it's controlled by the militias, and the militias are controlled by Iran. So you can see what's happening here. It's very difficult to know what's happening. Now, then you have the Saudi Arabia, and then you have the Gulf, the other countries of the Gulf. Now, Saudi Arabia is a very interesting situation today. The country has gone through truly a revolution within the kingdom. It has basically thrown out all the conservative religious elements. As you all know, that Saudi Arabia was controlled by the Wahhabi strain of Islam, and they had an iron hand on the people. In other words, you couldn't go anywhere. You always had the religious police who could arrest you if you didn't dress the right way, or could close your shop if you didn't close it when it was prayer time, or who stopped the women from, wearing anything they wanted, or who stopped women from working and whatnot. These guys have been just leveled. Today, the religious police does not exist anymore. Now, the funny thing is, it does exist because it's they have people, they have employees, and the employees are paid by the state, who then stops them from doing anything. But the religious police has no right to arrest anything. The religious police has no law to work with. They cannot arrest anybody. And that has totally changed the country. Today, men and women can actually work together, which they were not allowed to in the past. They can actually go out together in various cafes and various restaurants, which you could not do in the past. The atmosphere is totally different, and the young people are really basically as free as they are anywhere, and they are extremely knowledgeable about I'm sorry, I have to go back into this. Yes, they are very knowledgeable about the internet. There are, I think, on average, there are 4 telephones per person in Saudi Arabia. And I mean, it's unbelievable. And their ability to use the internet is absolutely unmatched anywhere, really. The country is growing very rapidly. They had an issue a couple years back because they were running out of money. And they were spending and spending and spending to modernize the country. And people were very worried about it. They have the crown prince has basically centralized all the power in his hands and makes all the decisions, and they are decisions to develop the country at any cost. And they've developed new cities, or they are developing new cities. There's one called Neom, which is supposed to be managed by robots, and which is from nowhere. I mean, there's nothing there. It's in the north of the kingdom, and it's supposed to be a totally open city, free for anybody to go and live and so on. And it's a rather beautiful area, but there's, it's pure desert. And they keep using all this, to make a green city. They will not use oil. They will only use renewable energy and so on. A lot of it is pure propaganda, really. But they actually believe it. And that's the difference. So you have a lot of people actually act on this. And we'll see how that goes. They have another plan now, which just started last year, which the Crown Prince has decided to develop Riyadh, the main capital city. When we lived in Riyadh with my wife in the 70s, there were 400,000 people in Riyadh. Now we have 6 million or something like that. So it's just unbelievable, the difference. But they are going, the Crown Prince has announced they were going to double the size of the city. Double. So now we'll have a city of 9 million people. It's huge. And one thing one should ask and doesn't seem that nobody is asking officially, but is where is the water going to come from? The water is already mostly coming by big pipelines from the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, and it's desalinated water for people, which is fine. But the desalinated water costs a lot of money, and you have to bring the water from the sea level to 700 meters, over 500 kilometers, 400 kilometers. And that's huge. The amount of energy it takes to do that is unbelievable, unbelievable. And where is the energy coming from if you want to be a green country? Well, for the moment, it's coming from burning oil and from natural gas. And they will not be able to do it otherwise. Now, they are very actively increasing their solar power, but solar is fine, is great, but it works only when there's sun. And if you don't have anything else, well, you need to burn oil and so on. So the country is really amazingly developing, mostly the atmosphere. People can talk and so on. There is still a lot of unhappiness among the more conservatives. I mean, the more conservatives they didn't die. They're still there, but they feel a little nervous that their whole way of life and mostly their approach to God is not only being questioned, it's forbidden. So we've reversed the equation on the most conservative extremist Muslims, if you like. They are now no longer able to impose their will on the people, but not only that, the people are imposing their will on them. And that creating some tension, no doubt. I remember talking to one of my Saudi students in Riyadh when I was there 2 years ago, He was mentioning to me that there are a lot of people, families, that are very upset because when they go to a restaurant, they are not sure whether there will be a family section and a section for the men and a section for the women, as there used to be. Now everybody's mixed up, and that bothers them. They don't want the women to mix with the men. And that's creating tension. Now, is it creating enough tension to make a revolution? I really don't think so. I think the young people, who are the vast majority of the people, I mean, I think 50% of the population is below the age of 21, is very happy with the system the way it is today. On the other hand, there's still another 50% who may or may not be that happy with things the way it's developing. So there are some issues. On top of it, the Crown Prince is not very good at making friends. As you know, he killed one of our good friends, Jamal Khashoggi, and even though I have great respect for the Crown Prince, we are still very upset about his killing of Jamal Khashoggi. I mean, in fact, we had dinner with him not a few months before he was killed by the Crown Prince. And as Talleyrand said, the French diplomat in the 18th century, he said it was worse than a crime, it was a mistake. And it was very much a mistake. And that has created an enormous problem for Saudi Arabia. It's created an enormous problem for the United States, because today Saudi Arabia has a terrible reputation in town, in Washington in particular. Congress is totally opposed to the Crown Prince, even though the Crown Prince is doing everything which we wanted Saudi Arabia to do, free the people, sort of keep away the extremists, develop the country, pump oil, because we like to have them pump oil, so it keeps the prices a little lower, etc., etc. But we are not able to help the Crown Prince at all, because he is still a murderer. And you have to, he's viewed by Congress as a murderer. Now, on top of it, and I think that's really key, knowing how the system works in this country, the political system, the Crown Prince killed Jamal Khashoggi for really minute reasons, because he was a Muslim brother, supposedly. We're not even sure yet. And, okay, maybe they made a mistake, and anyway, they killed him in a most gruesome way. But he killed a fellow who was by then a US resident. He was a green card holder, right? But mostly he was working for the Washington Post. Basically, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia ordered the killing of one of the employees of the richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos. And I cannot believe that Mr. Bezos took it lying down. And he will not take it lying down, and he should. But he has more means than everybody, including Saudi Arabia. And there will never be an arrangement for Saudi Arabia until the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia makes his peace with Jeff Bezos. Even though Jeff Bezos is very smart, never mentions Saudi Arabia ever. Every time there's any kind of a good thing that's happening on Saudi Arabia, there will be the next morning, there'll be another story which is negative. And that they will never, they have to understand that. I've mentioned that to as many Saudis as I can find, but it's very, very hard for them to know, one, that can be the case, and two, what can be done. Well, there are things that could be done, but it's probably not the place to do this, to discuss these things. Nevertheless, Saudi Arabia has a big problem in the United States today. Even though we love to sell arms to them, whether we are Democrats or Republican, we love to sell arms to the Saudis. We make a lot of money on that. We also need the Saudis to pump more oil because we need the prices to go down these days anyway. And it so happens that one of their big weaknesses in Saudi Arabia in terms of energy was the fact they didn't have enough natural gas. And it was, 5 years ago when I was talking about this, I would say, well, the problems in Saudi Arabia is they have oil, but they don't have enough gas because they need their gas for industrialization, and that's my baby. I love industrialization stuff. And, all the chemical plants and so on. But it so happens that they've discovered the second largest shale gas field in Saudi Arabia, near Bahrain, actually. But they've discovered it and they're beginning to get it going. They've also just discovered this week, they've announced the discovery of four more natural gas fields, 2 of them being traditional gas fields and 2 of them being shale gas fields. So they have enough gas now. They're not worried about that. But they need to continue working with us in order to keep the price of oil down. But the Saudis are so annoyed with the bad press they're getting in the United States and the bad press, the bad karma, if you like, with Congress in particular, that they are beginning to not trust the US anymore. And I think that's quite important. The fact that we left Afghanistan and we lost the war in Afghanistan is something that bothers them quite a bit. They were not very happy of us being there, but they helped us being there. I mean, the Saudi leadership is the one who created the Taliban to fight the Russians, remember? That goes back a few years. And we helped the Saudis develop the Taliban to fight the Russians. And then that turned around and the Taliban fought us. And, and we didn't do very well. So, and we left basically very poorly. So, and I'm glad we did, personally, but we left very poorly. So that gave a bad reputation to the United States, and which is, by the way, probably one of the reasons where Putin felt he could attack Ukraine, because he felt we were very weak. Now, the Saudis, the Saudis are feeling also that the United States is no longer as trustworthy and as full of support as we should be, or at least what they think we should be. As I said, they have no good press in Congress, no good press period in the press. They have very, very lot of criticism of Saudi Arabia. So they're looking elsewhere. Remember, the President Biden, 3 or 4 weeks ago, called the King of Saudi Arabia to see if the King could increase production of oil so that the prices could go down a little bit. Well, they said no, just simply. And they could. They have the capacity to do it. But they said no. And we have much less influence. On the other hand, the Saudis are very, very eagerly courting China. And China is developing like crazy in the Gulf. It's just amazing. And not only Saudi Arabia, but the UAE is courting China. And it's very interesting because the UAE, as you know, is on the Security Council for the moment. They are there for 1 year. And in the vote against on the vote on Ukraine, they didn't vote against Russia. They abstained, just like China did. So it's very interesting that the UAE is also afraid to, work too closely with the United States. So they are opening up to China. I mean, the Saudis and the UAE are opening up to China and limiting a little bit their dependence on the US. Now, one will say most of the time that the UAE and Saudi Arabia are extremely dependent on the United States, especially in terms of military power. And it's true. You know, if we decided to stop sending parts for the Saudi airplanes, there would be no Saudi airplanes flying. Well, but things are changing very rapidly. The UAE has tried to get F-35s out of the United States. And there has been some delays, and we are not sure, because Israel, of course, has F-35s and doesn't want them to have F-35s. So there's a lot of lobbying issues here. But what they did is they turned around, and the UAE just bought 3-4 months ago, they bought 80 French Rafale airplanes, which are not as good as the F-35s, but you know, it's close enough in this case. And that is really making a big difference. The UAE and the Saudis are moving away from becoming totally dependent on the United States. Saudi Arabia has just bought more missiles from China. And that, you know, that is a message that is being passed to us. So it's interesting to see that those situations are changing. Now let me go on Iran a little bit, because we are presently negotiating the JCPOA, the agreement on the nuclear issues with Iran. And you know, under President Trump, we left the JCPOA. And in all fairness, not that I'm not known to be pro-Trump, I can assure you, but the fact is the JCPOA was not a very good deal for us. It was in many ways because it delays Iran's approach to nuclear technology by 10, 20 years or so. The fact is, however, is that it did not stop Iran from doing anything else. And Iran has developed massive missiles facilities. And mostly, they developed, as I mentioned earlier at length, the relationship with Hezbollah. And through Hezbollah, and there's third parties, they control a lot of the region. So we haven't been, the JCPOA did nothing for that. And fact is, Iran today is very poor because they're not able to sell their oil as much as all that, but they are very, very powerful in the region. They control Syria, they control Lebanon, they control Yemen, they control Iraq. What else can you do? You know, and now they are poor. There's no doubt that they're suffering from all the sanctions. But now with the new JCPOA coming, if we sign the JCPOA, Iran will give us back the people, the prisoners that they're holding from, you know, our citizens. They're holding a few, so they'll release them. So it would be nice to get good press on that. And then they'll be able to say, oh, we won't do the nuclear. And the thing is, what would they do with the nuclear anyway? I mean, if they did decide to use a bomb on Saudi Arabia, you know, the next day they'd be wiped out of the earth, you know. So they know that. So basically, they're using this to get the right, basically, to become the hegemon of the Gulf. And we are not ready for that. And, you know, it's very easy for me to criticize. I don't know what else we could do than re-sign the JCPOA. But the fact is, you cannot trust the present regime in Iran to be nice guys. You know, they will try to take over the region because they feel it's their duty and their right, and that's what God wants them to do. So it's not looking very, very bright on these matters. So if we don't sign the JCPOA, we're sort of damned, and if we do, we're damned as well. Very tricky. So how do we fight that? Now, and how do we deal with Saudi Arabia when Saudi Arabia should be our main ally in the region, and now you know, we can't stand them anymore? It's very, very difficult. No, there's no easy solution. So, you know, I mean, if I had a job doing Middle East now, again, I would be doing that for the next 200 years. So there is a time when you have to retire from these things, you know. But it is not a pretty picture at this time. What's, in my view anyway, what's very positive is the developments in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but we have to come to some agreement with Saudi Arabia and the UAE where we can continue to have influence there, and we still cannot allow them to get away with murder. So we have to find a solution. And there are probably solutions to be had, but not simple ones, that's for sure. So why don't I just leave it at this for the moment, and we can perhaps have questions. Otherwise, I'll go on forever.
Question.
Yes, sir.
Where do you think the United States is exerting the most significant influence, whether through private business or the government, among the many countries that they talk?
You mean either private business or government influence? That's a very interesting point. I'm not sure. I mean, private business is very, very important in the region. For sure, the Saudis love to deal with American business. They prefer, I mean, even though they are very active now in China, they're investing in China, the Chinese, the amount of Chinese money and Chinese influence in the Gulf is just immensely growing. The local people prefer to deal with Americans, and they don't prefer to deal with Europeans, they prefer to deal with Americans. Now, why? Because they, first of all, 100,000 students, Saudi students, were in the United States, you know, and that creates a base of knowledge, understanding, language is very important. Not that many Chinese speak Chinese, not that many Saudis speak Chinese, a few, but not that many. So there is so many Saudis have lived in the United States, feel comfortable here, that there is a natural instinct to work with. And so the private companies have done very, very well there. The military companies are somewhere in between. And of course we sell tens of billions of dollars of stuff to the UAE and to the Saudis. And, and again, I think the relationship at the military level is excellent. But we, in terms of the politics of all this, I think the government at this point is under a great deal of pressure to work with the Saudi government is under pressure to work with the US, but they're also under pressure not to work with the US and to look elsewhere. So I think the natural instinct of the region is to work with the private individuals and the companies. But that's not quite enough at this point to really change the policy, because the policy has to really also be changed here. And again, you know, if you take on the richest man in the world who has a lot of interests worldwide, you're going to have problems getting, you know, a good system going for you. So they have to find a solution to that. We have to find a solution to this. Yes, ma'am. Well, this is interesting because one of the, since last time we talked on these matters, you have had the so-called Abraham Accords. And the Abraham Accords were an arrangement whereby Israel was recognized or accepted in the family of nations, if you like, by the Gulf countries, especially the UAE, who started some diplomatic relations, actually, with Qatar, and somewhat with Saudi Arabia, not entirely. So the Israelis now can travel to Saudi Arabia. the Saudis will travel to Israel. They will actually do business if necessary, and the Israeli business is very much appreciated, especially the security things, is very much appreciated. And anything that is a software which allow you to spy on your own people, where the Israelis are the kings, you know, they know this inside out, that's their big industry. The UAE love it, and the Saudis love it. So, you know, they prefer to deal with Israel than to deal with China on these matters. So there has been a lot of issues. Now, why? Because the Saudis in particular, but the Saudis and the UAE are extremely worried about Iran and the hegemonic approach of Iran. So therefore, they see that the United States is much less reliable in terms of defending them. So they feel that Israel is a better potential, because Israel does have, you know, atomic weapons, and they do have the air facilities to deliver those weapons if needed. So they are willing to work, you know, even though the Saudis and the UAE, but mostly the Saudis, are extremely upset about the policies of Israel in Palestine. For them, it's an existential issue. It's an existential issue with Iran. They're afraid that the Saudis are afraid that Iran is out to get them, and probably that's true. So they prefer to say, okay, we're very, very, very sorry that they are destroying the Palestinian identity, that they're taking over Palestine, etc., etc. But our interest is to work with the Israelis against Iran. So the Abraham Accord have been a great success, really, at this point. So Israel will continue to take advantage of this, to take over Palestine, as they have, to take over the West Bank totally, and basically will annex the West Bank. That's only a question of time. And they de facto have already. So. And the Saudis and the UAE will not do anything about it for the time being, anyway. I'm not sure I answered your question, but yes, sir. Well, the fact is, the Saudis have been thinking of a nuclear weapon for a long time. But you don't build a nuclear weapon just like that, right? You need to enrich the uranium and so on. Now, the Saudis have uranium, but they don't have, somebody told me that in order to even think of having any kind of nuclear bomb effort, you need at least 15,000 scientists on this topic. And they don't have that many people, really. They have a lot of very good engineers, but very few in nuclear issues. The Saudis do not have any nuclear plants, nuclear electric plants, reactors. The UAE do. The UAE has 3 reactors being built. 2 are existing and working today. 1 is being finished this year, and the 4th one is under construction. Those are built by the Koreans in the UAE. Now, the UAE does not have 15,000 nuclear scientists either. They only have 1 million people in the UAE. They have 12 million inhabitants, but only 1 million locals. Everybody else is from India and Pakistan and Philippines and so on. So they would have the possibility of developing that knowledge, but it's still they're too small, in other words, to really develop. So to have a nuclear proliferation based on, the Iranians trying to establish a bomb, being followed by the Saudis and so on, yes, perhaps, but I don't think we'll know this very soon. I think in our lifetime we won't see that. But it could happen, definitely. Now, remember, the Saudis have access, well, it's not entirely clear, But the Saudis have more or less access to the Pakistani military strength. And if Pakistan continues on its trend to become more and more extreme religiously, Pakistan has nuclear weapons. And some people have called the Pakistani nuclear weapons the Saudi bomb. Because, ultimately, if the Saudis really, really wanted to, they perhaps could buy a bomb from Pakistan. I somewhat doubt that personally. I just think that the price would be so high that the Saudis would not want to pay for that, to pay that much. But we don't know what the price would be. So yes, it could start that. But we already have India versus Pakistan, and it sort of tells us what we want to do as a country, And as a country, it means that we have to get much closer to India, so that we can compete with Pakistan, and keep them away, and have Iran be able to control. Have India be able to control Iran ultimately, which is what we were trying to do in Afghanistan. We were very close to the Indians in Afghanistan, but we didn't do too well there. And the Taliban were really created by the Saudis originally, but they were taken over by the Pakistanis. It's the Pakistanis who managed the Taliban. And today, the government of Afghanistan is pretty much controlled by the Pakistanis. So this is not very nice, all that, for us. So if we work closely with it, it sort of tells us we have to get closer to India. But India is very tough to deal with. They know that. And there are costs for that. And, it's interesting. I remember in the old days, India used to be the main partner to Russia. Why? Because Russia and China in those days were not friends, and India could play one against the other. And India needs China very badly in order to, needs Russia in order to compete with China. And we have 1.4 billion people versus 1.4 billion people there. And there are some skirmishes all the time at the border. So it's a pretty tense situation, all this. Now, we could play, and maybe that's what our revamped and very good Secretary of State, Blinken, there, I'm sure he knows all this stuff. And, us playing India against China is really probably in the cards. Except for that little problem we have with Ukraine at this point. Yes, sir.
Which Middle Eastern countries have the largest standing armies?
The largest standing armies, Iran for sure. Well, it all depends what we mean by the Middle East, But
Iran, Iraq, Syria.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, Iran has a very large army. Iraq has an army, but it does. Unfortunately, it has also a lot of militias who fight against the army. So they are very weak. Syria, Syria has a relatively large army, but it's basically controlled through Hezbollah by the Iranians as well. So to answer your questions very simply, the largest is by far is Iran, because Iran has 80 million people, and the UAE has 1 million people. And Saudi Arabia has 25 million people, or 30 including the foreigners, 35. But Iraq has they have a military, but the military has been very much destroyed by us. We destroyed the entire leadership of the military when we first took over Iraq 15 years ago, I forgot when. And but they still have a military, but as I said, they also have a whole bunch of militias which are controlled by Iran, and which are stopping the military from having any power. So Iraq is no longer a factor in terms of military.
Why doesn't Iran invade Saudi Arabia?
Well, it's not that simple. No, they can't. They can't, because to create an invasion requires a lot of ships to invade, a lot of airplanes and so on. And the Saudis have a pretty strong military. And also, at this point, it would ensure that we would still come in, and basically we have a huge base in Bahrain, which is right at the border to Saudi Arabia. The Fifth Fleet is there. We have our largest air base in the world. Our largest air base is in Qatar. And it's full of airplanes there, which we could destroy basically any kind of invasion. So they're smart enough not to do that. They do it the other way. They do it under the radar through facilitating Hezbollah, basically. So, yes, ma'am. I'm glad you're bringing this up. Oman is a fascinating place. Oman is going through a fair amount of change right now, because the old Sultan of Oman died last year and was replaced by his nephew. And Oman has very little wealth. It's a relative, it has some natural gas, not enormous amounts, but some natural gas. And it always has been the intermediary between Iran and the rest of the Arab world. Now, there's a very, very interesting religious aspect to all this, where the leadership of Oman is Ibadi, which is a sect of Islam which is now, these days, or for the last 100 years or so, has been seen as quite liberal. So they were very opposed to the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia and so on. The fact is, the Ibadis 300 years ago were, the very, very nasty and fighting and so on, but now they're viewed as being sort of neutral in the various, between Sunnis and Shia. They're viewed somewhere in between the two. So they view themselves as, today, and rightly so, as sort of the arbiters, if you like, between the Sunnis of Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the Shia of Iran and Iraq. And so they are well respected, very well respected. Even though they don't have huge amounts of money, it's a relatively small country. They only have, 10 million people altogether, I think. But it's a very mixed group of people. I said they are Ibadis, but in fact that's a relatively small group. There are a very large Shia community, very large Sunni community, and they have the government tends to be more Ibadi. So, but it's a very beautiful place, magnificent place. It is close to the United States in the sense that we have the right to bring our ships and so on, as it was close to the Brits originally. And the old Sultan, who was Sultan for 50 years or so, was actually went to school in England, to school at the military college in England. So very close to all these people. But they're very neutral. And they try to sort of bring peace. No, who respects that, But they are really good people. It's a good place, Oman. And, they have a very large Yemeni population because their biggest border is with Yemen. Well, one of their biggest borders is with Yemen. But the Yemenis that are in Oman, there was a civil war between that's the south of Oman and the north of Oman for many, many years. And that was resolved by the Sultan. And they made a compromise. There was actually a compromise between the northern forces and the southern forces, and they worked together very well. And since then, it's been extremely stable, and that hasn't changed. And even the new Sultan is a little more open to sharing power with other people. So it's a very interesting place. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
It's always been really interesting. I'm just curious if you
In 5 years, we'll have 300 sheep. Although that is not any more sure than having peace in the Middle East.
I just find it fascinating that it sounds like Iran is kind of a big player
Right now, yes, yes, and we'll see how, and that is it still to this day. It will be our biggest headache, although at this point we're busy with other issues. Yeah. Now, just a quick finale, if you like, on Ukraine. I think from our standpoint, the big problem with Ukraine and for Europe and the United States on a day-to-day basis, I don't mean about the moral implication, but the price of energy is going to go through the roof. You know, Russia sells 40% of the gas, natural gas used in Western Europe comes from Russia. And Russia produces 10 million barrels a day of oil, they export 4 million barrels. Now, we in the United States are the ones who are going to suffer the least from this, because all it's bringing is a price of oil, you know, close to $100 a barrel, which means we can produce as much oil as we want, because we have the ability to do it. We can produce natural gas at the same time. So for us, it's not a big problem. For the Europeans, it's a huge problem. I tell you, a story I told other people before is I was visiting the Bayer Industries. Bayer is the largest chemical plant company in the world, by far. And their biggest plant by far is in Friedrichshain in Germany, on one side of the Rhine River. And you go there, and the thing is the size of Anne Arundel County. I mean, that's the factory, you know. And you go there, you have the river, and then they tell you, you see that big pipe, and there's a pipe this wide, which goes under the river and on the other side. This is natural gas coming directly from Russia, because all their production is based on natural gas, like most chemicals, and is coming directly from Russia. If the Russians stop the gas, Bayer has to get out of business. And that would be, for Germany, and for a lot of people, it's a major disaster. So that has to change. And we have to help Germany diversify away. But it doesn't come overnight. Now, we tried for a long time, you know, President Obama and President Trump and everybody tried to get the Germans to diversify their gas supply, but they have not succeeded. And you know, the big question here was that we stopped the Germans from finishing what's called the Nord Stream 2, because that's the gas directly from China, under the Gulf of Bosnia and all that, going straight into Germany. That's fine, and they finally agreed not to do it. And by the way, the chairman of that Russian company is the former prime minister of Germany. So anyway, but there is something called Nord Stream 1, which produces 55 million cubic meters of gas. And nobody's talking about stopping Nord Stream 1, which is the only thing the Russians could listen to. But we're not going to do that, because that would really hurt Germany. I mean, it's no doubt. Not only Germany, but a lot of other places. Anyway, that's